Hello and welcome back to Sea Bonnies. We're finishing up the story today. It's been not as bad as people have said, in my opinion. I've talked about my opinions on this story a lot, so I'm gonna not do that a bunch again today. I'm just gonna get straight to it. So let's do that. Dr. T might have been one of the nicest people Mott had ever met, though even nicer than Mott's mom. His mom occasionally lost her temper, but Dr. T never did. Mott tried to concentrate on how nice Dr. T was, but the whispered voices got louder. He was hearing more full sentences now. "You don't know what you're dealing with," for example, came out clearly. Mott tried to keep his breathing steady while he watched Dr. T type. He felt sweat trickle down between his shoulder blades, and he squirmed. He was attempting to stay calm, but these cramps and the relentless whispers were terrifying. What was happening inside his body? Mott abruptly rose up on an elbow. He glanced at his belly, and he frowned. Did his belly look lumpy? He thought it did. Is this going to be a room for one more type situation? In Room for One More, spoilers in case you haven't seen it, what was the guy's name? Stanley? I think it was Stanley. He basically he gets a bunch of mini arenas inside of him, from Sister Location, and then they, I don't know, make him, blow up, basically. It's a weird story, but it's one of my favorites, actually. And I guess this is the same thing, but with a very new character that we don't know anything about, don't have any attachment to. I guess, maybe. No, I don't know. I'm just guessing. But we'll see. Mott abruptly rose up. Oh, I already read that. "Okay," Dr. T said. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to get Louise in here to draw some blood. The blood test will tell me if you have an infection. When she's done with that, Louise will probably do an ultrasound. That'll tell me if we're looking at a gallbladder issue, which is a possibility." Mott nodded. He didn't bother to ask questions about his gallbladder. He pointed at his belly. "Do you think my stomach looks lumpy? I think it looks lumpy." Dr. T stood and looked down at Mott's stomach. "It looks normal to me, and I didn't feel any masses." Mott frowned. "Okay." Dr. T patted Mott, I keep wanting to say Matt, patted Mott's thigh. When you feel like crap, it's easy for the mind to start imagining all kinds of worst-case scenarios, so let's start your treatment right away, even while we get the test set up. "What treatment?" Dr. T flipped his computer screen, turning it into a tablet. He tapped the screen and handed it to Mott. "Watch this. Louise will be here in a few minutes to draw blood and do an ultrasound." Dr. T pressed a button, and the upper part of the table Mott lay on raised a little. "That work?" Mott nodded. He took the tablet. Dr. T patted his leg again. "I'll be back after I look at your tests. In the meantime," he pointed at the tablet screen Mott held. "Watch that." Oh, this is gonna scare him more. Dr. T strode from the room, closing the door behind him. Mott, cringing at another round of cramping, looked at the screen. It was frozen on a video of a stand-up comic routine. He managed a half-smile and shook his head. Leave it to Dr. T to prescribe laughter. Maybe the laughter helped. Mott had been tempted to set aside Dr. T's tablet and just be miserable while he waited for Louise, but two more intense cramps and a whispered, "Your time is coming," got him to hit play on the screen. He hadn't heard of the comedian in the video, but he was really funny. Mott managed to chuckle at first, and then he was actually laughing so hard that Louise, a small dark-haired woman in a ponytail, had to pause the video while she took blood. She let him watch again while she did the ultrasound, which she did silently. After a few minutes of feeling her pressing her magic wand, as she called it, all over his stomach, Mott asked, "Do you see anything?" "I don't, kiddo," she said, "but we'll have Dr. T come in and give a look-see to be sure." The look-see came quickly. Dr. T studied the scan and grinned at Mott. "Everything looks normal." "Really?" Mott frowned. "Then why do I feel so bad?" "Honestly, I'm not 100% sure, but my guess is you have food poisoning. I'll know more when I get your blood work. But nothing horrible is going on." Mott nodded. "Okay." Dr. T squeezed his shoulder. "Your enthusiasm is overwhelming," he chuckled. "How about this? Why don't you get dressed and go hang out on the sofa in my office? I have a couple more patients to see, then I'm heading home. I'll give you a ride." Mott nodded again. When Dr. T and Louise left the room, Mott sat up on the edge of the exam table and took in what Dr. T had said. He tried believing it. "You're fine," he told himself out loud. "Liar, liar, pants on fire," the whispers continued. Mott shook his head and stood up to get dressed. "You're not real," he said to the whispers. "I'm fine." Although he could have sworn he heard sibilant laughter in his head, Mott ignored it and got dressed. Strangely, the cramping had abated a little. Maybe it was the laughter, but it was more likely the power of suggestion. He was comforted by the results of the ultrasound. If something foreign had been in his belly, the scan would have found it, right? Right. Mott was able to walk semi-normally down the clinic's hallway. Behind the purple and white striped door of exam room 2, near Dr. T's office, a little girl giggled. Mott smiled. It was a nice sound, much nicer than the poisonous murmurs in his head. He pushed open the door of Dr. T's office and dropped onto Dr. T's overstuffed blue and yellow polka dot couch. Listening to the continued giggling, he fell asleep. He woke only long enough for Dr. T to walk him out of Dr. T's new SUV and get him home. Then he went up to his bed, and he fell back asleep. When Mott woke up, it was dark, but the dark wasn't nighttime dark. It was pre-dawn dark. He sat up. He'd slept for over 12 hours. Taking stock, he realized he felt okay. His stomach was sore, but he wasn't cramping like before. The whispers were still in his head, but they seemed muted. Fumbling for a small bedside lamp, Mott switched it on. As soon as the light poured onto his nightstand, he saw a bottle of water, several crackers in a plastic bag, and a note. He picked up the note. Mott, you were sleeping soundly, and Ron said that was the best thing for you, so I didn't wake you. I've left you some crackers in case you wake up hungry. If you need me, come and get me. Love you, Mom. Mott smiled and reached for the bottle of water. He was really thirsty, so he quickly unscrewed the lid. He started to bring the bottle to his lips, but then he stopped. He held the bottle under the glow of his lamp, and he studied it. He rolled his eyes. It was just water. Bottled water in a sealed container. It was fine. He drank some water, and he reached for the crackers. Leaning back on his pillows, he opened the plastic bag and plucked out a whole wheat cracker. Munching on it, he looked around his semi-dark room, at the nature posters and photos of his favorite baseball stadiums, at the shelves full of video games and math puzzle books, at the closet he knew was stuffed with his clothes and hiking and fishing gear. He took comfort in being reminded of who he was. He wasn't Mott, a boy infested by sea bonnies. He was Mott, lover of baseball and video games and math and camping out, best friend to Nate and Lyle, a good brother to Rory, and maybe soon-to-be boyfriend to Teresa. He was a normal teen. You're a freak, the Whisperer counted. Yeah, and you're not real, he told them. In the light of this new day, it felt even more true. He shook his head. Sea bonnies couldn't even hatch without purified water above 75 degrees. How were they going to survive his stomach acid? He chuckled as he kept munching on crackers and looking around his room. Over Mott's desk, opposite his bed, he had a dark green bulletin board covered in photos. The photos represented his favorite things and best memories. The one in the middle was a picture of him and his dad sitting in a rowboat in the middle of the lake, where his family had a summer cabin. His dad always got a couple weeks off in July, and they went to the cabin to swim and hike and fish. Mott usually felt disconnected from his dad, but when they fished, he felt close to fish. Mott dropped his half-eaten cracker and sat up. His reminiscing had reminded him of Fritz, the fish that was no longer a fish when Mott flushed it down the toilet with the sea bonnies. He hadn't imagined the way not Fritz had looked when Mott had last seen him. He might have been imagining the whispers, but he'd seen what he'd seen. Fritz had been eaten by the inside out and replaced by sea bonnies. He was pretty sure fish had stomach acid too, and yet the sea bonnies had still managed to get him. Mott looked down at his belly. Setting aside the plate, he raised his shirt with a trembling hand. He put his palm against his skin. It was normal, wasn't it? Mott thought about how horrible he'd felt the day before, and how he felt now. He'd assumed the end of his cramps was a good thing. But what if all that meant was that the sea bonnies had finished their work on his stomach? Maybe he felt better because his belly was no longer being consumed. It was now something else. His not belly. Mott gingerly felt all over his stomach. Did it feel different than it used to? More gelatinous? Mott groaned and wiped the bag of crackers off his lap. They hit the floor with a muffled crunch, and Mott slid all the way on under his covers, pulling them up over his head. He wanted to escape. To hide from the world. No, what he wanted to do was hide from the sea bonnies, and from himself. You can't hide, the whispers told him. Yeah, Mott said. Watch me. Mott covered his ears and started humming. That's where his mom found him. Under his covers, humming like a little kid, when she came into his room, still in her robe, to check on him. Mott? He threw back the covers and looked at her. Apparently he looked worse than he felt. As soon as her gaze landed on his face, she frowned and said, You're staying home again today. He didn't argue with her. After his mom and Rory left the house, Mott dropped back into sleep, but he didn't stay asleep for long. This was unfortunate, because as soon as he was awake, his mind was inundated by the whispers again. The whispers in Mott's head, however, were no longer whispers. They were full-on shouts. If he didn't drown them out, he was going to lose his mind. Mott threw back his covers and dashed to his desk to get his earbuds. Putting them in, he started filling his ears with driving rock music. He could still hear the shouts. What could he do? He looked around. His gaze landed on his shelves, and he reached out and picked up one of his handheld video games. He got back under the covers, and he turned on the game. Mott spent the better part of the day trying to drown out the shouts, but not even deafening rock music and fast-moving video games could beat them down. Then, sometime during the afternoon, maybe a little after 2, Mott started feeling odd. When he stopped his game to figure out why he felt that way, he realized he had a strange vibration in his chest and belly. It was like the very faintest suggestion of movement, as if something was shaking his organs from the inside. He felt like his heart was going to burst. Mott picked up the phone and called Dr. T's office. He didn't want to go through Claudia. "Hello, this is Dr. Tabor." Mott gripped the phone. "Dr. T, this is Mott." "Hey, Mott, how are you feeling this morning?" That's the thing. I still feel weird." "Still cramping?" "Not so much cramping as, like, shaking on the inside. Like my organs are, trembling." For 4 seconds, Mott counted. The only thing he heard through the phone was the faintest of hisses in the line. Then Dr. T said, "Let's do this. I'm on my way over to the hospital to visit a couple patients before I head home for a while. I need to go back in late tonight to work on inventory with Claudia, so I'm leaving the clinic early. Why don't I stop by and get you? We'll see if we can squeeze you in for a CAT scan. Shouldn't be a problem. Given what you're telling me, I can get insurance approval for it. Do you want me to talk to your mom before I come over?" "I'll do it," Mott said quickly. He didn't want to worry his mother. Dr. T was quiet for another few seconds. "Okay, I'll talk to her later instead, after the scan. That would be good." As soon as he hung up the phone, Mott scribbled a note for his mom on the back of the note she left for him, just in case she got home before he did. The note was filled with lies, but the truth was out of the question. What was he supposed to write? "Mom, I've gone to get a scan to see if sea bunnies are eating me from the inside out. No, that wouldn't be a good idea." He settled with an evasive lie. "Mom, I'm feeling better. Gone out to get some fresh air. We'll call later. Love you, Mott." Mott sat in front of Dr. T's small oak desk in his clinic's office. He was on the phone talking to another doctor, one who had analyzed the CAT scan. Mott wasn't listening to what Dr. T was saying. He didn't really care at this point. He'd already heard enough from Dr. T himself. Now he was just trying to stay calm. So, he was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, and he was staring at his shoes. There was a brown speck in one of his athletic shoes. He was using it as a focal point, concentrating on it the way a seasoned meditator might stare at a candle. He wondered if he should try a mantra, or maybe an Om. He needed something to tether him to sanity, because the facts were dragging him quickly toward madness. Apparently, the scan had revealed abnormalities in Mott's stomach, intestines, lung, and heart. They looked variegated in a way that was inconsistent with normal tissue. The doctors were now discussing potential causes of the abnormalities. Were they tumors? Were they evidence of some sort of systemic infection? No and no. The doctors knew of no biological cause that could be responsible for the scan's results. Mott didn't care about the discussion because he already knew what had caused the variegated appearance of his organs. He knew it as soon as Dr. T showed him the results of the CAT scan. "Here's what the scan revealed," Dr. T said, tapping a few keys on his laptop to bring up the images of Mott's scan. Dr. T had pointed to light-colored clubs clustered between all of Mott's intestines, his stomach, his lungs, his heart. The clubs were grayish-white, and they had small, dark specks sprinkled throughout. At first glance, the specks appeared to be random, but when Mott had leaned closer to Dr. T's computer screen, it was obvious the specks weren't haphazard. No, they came in pairs. And they weren't specks, they were eyes. If you really studied the clubs, you could see that they were made of elongated forms, each vaguely rabbit-shaped, each with 2 dark dots. Mott had already almost thrown up when he'd seen the truth of what was going on inside him, but for some reason, he hadn't been able to. He'd gagged, but nothing had come up. Dr. T hung up the phone, steepled his fingers, and looked at Mott across his desk. "Dr. Jenkins and I agree that the scan's anomalies don't fit anything seen before. That's a good thing. It means the scan's results are likely caused by an issue with the scan itself, interference with the machine. He suggested we repeat the scan tomorrow morning, and I think that's a good idea." Mott tore his gaze away from the brown spot in his shoe. He looked at Dr. T. Ignoring the rippling sensation that he felt in his chest, he said, "We don't need to repeat the scan. I know what it is." He was shocked by how calm he sounded. His words were totally flat. Too flat, actually. He sounded a little like a robot, but that was just because he was too stunned to bother with putting inflection in his words. Dr. T frowned at Mott. "What do you think it is, Mott? Is there something you haven't told me?" Mott figured Dr. T thought Mott had taken something he shouldn't have taken. In a way, he had, but not on purpose. Mott shook his head. "No, I mean, yes, but it's not what you think." Dr. T raised his eyebrows and waited. "The thing is," Mott said, scooting forward in his seat, "a few days ago, Rory got some sea bodies from Freddy Fazbear's pizzeria." Dr. T frowned at question. "They're kind of like sea monkeys," Mott said. "You know, those brine shrimp things." Dr. T nodded. "A couple of days after they hatched," Mott continued, "I noticed that Fritz, Rory's goldfish, which shared the tank with the sea bodies, didn't look right. When I really looked closely, I could tell that, well, he was no longer a goldfish. It was like the sea bodies had eaten him from the inside, infested him." Mott could tell from Dr. T's blank expression that Mott was losing him. When Dr. T opened his mouth to speak, Mott started talking faster, almost running his words together, the same way Rory did when he got excited. "And that's what made me realize I had to get rid of the things, which I did. I flushed them. And Rory was all upset, but later that night I got a drink of water, and I felt something going down my throat, and I tried to convince myself it wasn't a sea body, but now I think it was, and I think it started eating my tissue, and it multiplied, and now my insides are turning into sea bodies, the same way Fritz turned into sea bodies. They're eating me from the inside, and they're coming together to replace my organs. I think that's why I feel so weird on the inside, like I'm jiggling from within, like gelatin, sort of, but not exactly." Mott stopped talking. He concentrated on breathing in and out, which, for obvious reasons, was becoming harder than usual. He tried not to think about masses of sea bodies roiling around together to form the walls of his lungs. Dr. T took a deep breath. "It's time to call your mom." Mott slumped in his chair. Several hours later, near midnight, Mott sat on the edge of his bed. Once again, he was staring at the brown spot in his shoe. He'd been staring at his shoe for a long time, an abnormally long time. He was staring at it mostly because he didn't know what else to do. He stared at it through the better part of the evening, listening to Rory chatter at his mom, listening to his mom trying to get Rory to calm down and go to bed, listening to Rory finally settle into his room, listening to his mom's footsteps pause outside Mott's door and then continue on to her room. Obviously, she decided to deal with him in the morning. Outside, thunder rumbled. Finally, the weather suited the situation. When they left the clinic earlier in the morning, Mott had noticed the ozone smell in the air, and he turned his face up to the soft rain starting to fall. For an instant, it had soothed him, but just for an instant. A streak of jagged lightning on the horizon had brought him back to his intolerable reality. Nothing he was facing could be eased by a little bit of rain. Now the rain matched how Mott felt. It wasn't soft or soothing. It was angry and insistent. He could hear it thrumming on the roof, assaulting the house like thousands of jackhammers, trying to drill through the shingles. When Mott's mom had brought him home and asked him to go up to his room, she'd followed him as far as his doorway. Then she'd said, in the strained voice she used when she was trying to remain calm but wanted to scream hysterically, "Please stay in here. We'll talk later." For hours, Mott had been thinking about what that talk would be like. How could he convince her he wasn't crazy? Did he even want to try? Would it be better if he was crazy? When you weighed the pros and cons, crazy was definitely the preferred scenario. If he was crazy, the worst that could happen was that he might get put in a mental hospital for a while. Maybe he'd have to do group therapy, talk about his feelings, and eat yucky tapioca pudding. But he'd be Mott. He'd be Mott, made up of his own parts, a human, normal. The alternative to crazy was being not Mott, absolutely unable to forget what not Fritz looked like. Mott knew that when the sea bodies were done with him, if they were consuming him from the inside, Mott wouldn't be anything remotely resembling a human. And that meant Mott's life would be over. He wanted to convince himself he was crazy, he really did, but the problem with that was the CAT scan. He wasn't the only person who'd seen something weird on the scan. Dr. T had seen it. And so had the other doctor. They hadn't been sea bodies, of course, because their minds didn't let them entertain something so absurd, something so outside the bounds of what science understood to be possible. But they had seen something. Mott wasn't imagining the physical changes in his body. This was a very worrying fact. Mott felt an itch on his forearm, and he idly scratched it. It still itched. He scratched harder. When the spot kept itching, he looked down at his arm, and there, where it itched, something moved just under the skin. Mott stood up as fast as he could, and he got dizzy, and he immediately collapsed back onto the bed. He swallowed hard and stared at his arm. Yes, there, the faintest of elongated lumps were slithering under the surface of his skin. Mott groaned. His whole forearm started to itch, and he scratched at it so hard that he broke the skin. In horror, he stared at the blood welling up. Flicking up through the blood, the tail of a sea bonny squirmed in the red thickness. His eyes nearly bugged out of his head. Mott watched the sea bonny tail disappear as the sea bonny dove back down under his skin. If he could have sawed his arm off right then and there and thrown it away, he would have. His whole arm itched now, and he could see that the movement was all up and down his arm. Not only that, his skin was changing color right in front of his eyes. His skin was losing its normal pigment. It was becoming translucent. It was turning a pale shade of purple-blue. Mott looked at his other arm. The same thing was happening to it. For several seconds, Mott didn't move. He wasn't even sure he was breathing. He became a statue, a frozen collection of mutating cells overseen by a brain incapable of accepting the impossible transformation. Because this had to be impossible. He couldn't really be sitting here watching sea bonnies eat his skin from underneath. He was not seeing them take bite after bite of his cells, ingesting and integrating what used to be part of him, and turning it into more of them. He wasn't being devoured and replaced by sea bonnies. This wasn't real. Maybe there was something wrong with his eyes. Maybe he was hallucinating. Suddenly, able to move as if released by some paralytic drug or evil magic spell, Mott jumped to his feet and ran to his dresser. Leaning over the top of it, pushing aside his deodorant and his hairbrush, he peered into his own eyes in the mirror, and he saw a sea bonny swim through the white surrounding his left iris. Then he saw two wind around the darker flecks of the brown in his right iris. Mott lost what was left of his grip on reality. He ran for the door, intending to flee the house, but he stopped when he heard his mother's voice in the hallway. He couldn't face her like this. What if he infected her? He needed to get back to Dr. T now that it was obvious what was happening to Mott. Maybe Dr. T could help him. He said he was going back to the clinic to work that night. Mott had to get to the clinic. Mott whirled and raced to his window. Throwing it open, he popped the screen and climbed out into the night, onto the roof of the deck. Immediately, the rain stung his skin and his eyes. He didn't care. He crawled quickly to the edge of the porch roof, and he bent over to grab the top of a downspout. Not concerned about cutting his hands, Mott wrapped them around the metal and swung his legs over the edge of the roof. Grasping the gutter spout with his arms and legs, he slid down it like a fireman's pole, and he hit the ground hard. His ankle turned, and pain shot up through his leg, but he ignored it. He also ignored the pain throbbing in his hands. Mott looked into the darkness extending beyond his house. Why hadn't he brought a flashlight? Well, maybe because he was a little distracted by being eaten by sea bonnies. That was a reasonable excuse. Between the night and the rain coming down and almost solid walls of water, it was nearly impossible to see. That was okay. He knew his yard, and he knew the forest behind it. He'd find his way. He could have gone out to the sidewalk, where streetlights would show him the way, but he didn't want to be by the street. There were too many cars with bright headlight beams he didn't want to be caught in. So Mott sloshed through the grass in his yard, and he scaled the fence at the back. He figured he could follow the green belt through his neighborhood. He knew if he stuck to the relatively narrow band of trees, they'd eventually lead him back to Dr. T's clinic. It was just a mile or so. He could walk it. Mott was so drenched by the time he reached the trees that his clothes clung to him like they were part of him. Or maybe they were a part of the sea bonnies now. Light from the houses along the green belt reached into the forest, enough so Mott could see the ground was covered with standing water. Huge puddles had formed in the spongy loam under the old trees. The water was getting caught up in the depressions between vast root systems stretching through the underbrush. Mott ran through the puddles and stumbled over knobby roots, occasionally falling against a rough tree trunk. As he ran, he scratched his arms, which still itched incessantly, intensely. He couldn't stop digging at himself. Not long after Mott left his house, he didn't know how long, because time was becoming something that made no sense to him, Mott scratched hard at his bicep, and when he pulled his hand away, he saw in the yellow glow from someone's porch light that he'd torn out a huge chunk of his own flesh. No, not his own flesh. When Mott looked at what he held in his hand, he recoiled, staggering back into the branches of an old oak tree. Instead of embracing him, the twigs prodded and speared him, but that didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the fact that Mott was holding a handful of madly swimming sea bodies instead of the flesh he thought he'd pulled away from his arm. Sickened, Mott flung the swimming creatures to the ground. He started to hurry on, but noticed the sea bodies were swimming energetically, coming together in an organized school to follow the rivulets from one puddle to the next. He stopped and stared, then realized they were swimming after him. They were pursuing him. Mott took off. He started reeling through the trees, zigging this way and that, not just to avoid the trees, but to evade the sea bodies coming after him. He wished he could hear them advancing, so he knew where they were. He knew better than to stop and turn to see them, then catch up if he did. But he couldn't hear them. Mott could hear nothing but the staccato rhythm of the rain and his own rapid breathing. He managed about 10 ungainly strides over the uneven ground before he tripped and went down on one knee. As soon as he did, the sea bodies were there. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. They immediately swam up his jeans and found their way to his arms, where they reattached themselves. Mott could feel his body reabsorbing the wriggling creatures. He also realized that he could feel the sea bodies all through his body now. They were in every vein, every pore, every nerve, every organ, and every artery, every system in his entire body. They were everywhere. Mott turned his face to the sky and he screamed. He screamed out his fear, his disbelief, and his rage. He screamed the insanity of it all. He screamed because what else could he do but scream? He didn't know how to fight this battle. He didn't understand it. He couldn't even believe it. He was also pretty sure he'd already lost it. But then again, maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe Dr. T could help him. Mott had to get to the clinic. Mott started running again, squinting to see through the rain and the trees. He wiped his eyes, but instead of clearing his vision, this just wiped away another glop of sea bodies. He wiped it away, and he could see that in the glow of someone else's pool lights, it hit a tree branch. Immediately, the sea bodies slithered down the trunk, found a narrow channel of water between two roots, and followed it back to Mott. He felt the sea bodies slip up his shin as he kept running. Finally, Mott reached the end of the greenbelt. He careened off of one last tree, and he stepped out into the rain-pounded sidewalk that led to the back door of the clinic. No, that wasn't right. He didn't actually step out. He flopped out. He couldn't step anymore because he was constantly coming apart. With every motion he made, pieces of his flesh fell away and turned into a heaving swell of sea bodies, which swam chaotically, and then coalesced into a formation that once again sought their fellows, and they, of course, were in Mott. Not Mott. Mott wasn't Mott anymore, and he knew it. He tried to dismantle himself. He pulled at his cheeks and his ears, at his arms and his chest and his hips. He tore off handfuls of his flesh and tissue, throwing them aside. He realized some remote part of his brain, maybe a part not infested yet with the sea bodies, thought that if he could tear enough of himself away, he might unearth the last few cells of Mott that were still Mott. But each time Mott discarded parts of himself, the parts became determined masses of sea bodies that doggedly found a way back to him, reattaching and reassimilating faster each time he tried to toss them. They were now doing that so powerfully that Mott even heard a sound when they came rushing back to him. It was a slurp, kind of like sucking the last bit of milkshake through a straw. But that description was too benign. The sea bodies weren't benign, they were malevolent through and through. All the sea bodies wanted to do was vanquish every aspect of Mott. They wanted to vanquish him and conquer him. They wanted to be more than a colony. They wanted to be an empire formerly known as Mott. No matter what Mott did to resist them, the sea bodies retaliated and resurged. They filled back in every hole created by his self-demolition efforts. When the chunks of flesh Mott lobbed away hit the ground, they immediately separated into swimming sea bodies, which began returning to Mott. To get to him, they followed the standing water on the ground. They used the puddles. They even took advantage of falling raindrops. Any and all water became a conduit, leading them back to Mott. Once they reached him, the sea bodies sought any ingress they could find. They swam up his pants legs. They slithered around his shirt. They wriggled over his shoes. They returned to themselves and their version of Mott every single time. As Mott fought this battle, he managed to get around the side of the clinic. He was now close to the front door. Collapsing every few seconds as he attempted to extract parts of himself, only to have them reform immediately afterward, Mott realized he had very little time left. He realized his thoughts were not really thoughts anymore. They were fragments. He was having trouble thinking of the people he cared about, his mom, Rory, his friends, Teresa. He tried to conjure images of them all in his head, but he could only see pieces of them. Soon he'd no longer be anything like what he used to be. How much time did he have? Maybe minutes, maybe seconds. Of the trillions of cells that had originally made up Mott, he figured only a few thousand were still as they had been before the invasion. Mott managed the last few feet to the clinic door. He reached for it, only to have his hand disintegrate in front of him and drop to the wet concrete. Claudia looked up from her computer screen, out through the darkened waiting room, to the blackness beyond the clinic's windows. The clinic was hushed and still, and perhaps because it was too quiet, in spite of the storm, she could hear something odd outside. It was kind of like a splashing sound, but not a normal rain splattering the ground. It was a bigger sound than that. It sounded like something large and squishy was falling into a body of water now and then. What Claudia heard between the splashes was odd, too. She heard a sort of suctioning sound, almost a whistling. This was similar to the weird noise her vacuum made whenever she accidentally sucked up something wet. After the third time she heard that noise, Claudia decided to look around the clinic and see what might be causing the peculiar noises. Making sure her computer was secure, Claudia stood and walked through the hushed waiting room. Hesitating for a couple seconds by the door, and not sure why, Claudia eventually pushed the heavy glass door open. She peered out into the deluge and saw Mott. Mott stood there standing in heavy rain as if it was a perfectly normal thing to do. The rain sluiced over his brown hair, which was matted to his head. It ran down his face, and it pattered against his clothing. Claudia wasn't sure what to make of this. She decided to act the same way Mott was acting, as if everything was normal. Hello, Mott, Claudia said. She kept her expression neutral. Claudia had known Mott since he was a baby. He was a nice boy, never a problem at the clinic. He'd been in yesterday and this morning, she knew. She didn't know why. Dr. T didn't discuss his patients with Claudia, even when the patient was a part of the family. Mott didn't look particularly healthy, though. He had an unnatural bluish tint, and he was so pale he was almost see-through. When Mott didn't respond to her, Claudia asked her, "Are you okay?" Suddenly, Mott smiled. "Yes, it's a nice day. Everyone should be outside." Again, Claudia was a little nonplussed. She leaned forward to look in Mott's eyes. She was checking to see if his pupils looked okay. They did. She smiled at him. He smiled back. Then he turned and walked away into the rain. Claudia tried to see where he was going. She thought maybe she should call him back. But it was too late. The rain was coming down so relentlessly that once Mott was a few feet away, he seemed to disappear. Wow, okay. That's the end of Sea Bodies. Definitely a pretty good ending, actually. I really liked the ending there. The rest of the story took way too long, and the idea was weird. But that ending, I don't know. It was pretty good. The story was pretty good. It would work pretty well as a Goosebumps story, I think. But, I don't know. I feel like I keep saying this over and over, but it's just not very FNAF, you know? That's the main thing. Everything else about this story is good. Alright, I'll read Together Forever next. That is coming very soon. And I've heard that the Stitch Wraith story is also really good. Although I haven't read it yet. I've actually managed to avoid all spoilers this time around, which isn't normal for me. So I guess we'll see what that's all about. Thank you guys for listening. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.